thank you for the organizers and Pablo to invite me. Apologies to the translators because I use a lot of neologisms, new words. And sorry that I don't speak Spanish. But I hope you can follow me. I would like to start with two references. Last week I got an email from a video from a sociologist called Michel Bauwens, and it was called the interregnum. So basically the old society is dying, but the new one is not ready yet to take over. And so these are very unstable periods in history where the things that we are used to are declining, but we don't really clearly see, what's going to replace it. The second quote is from Buckminster Fuller, I think, and he said, "The future is already there, it's just not evenly distributed yet." Right? So in other words, if you want to look at how the world of tomorrow may look like, you have to look at people who are creating seed forms. They are creating models today that may actually be the model for tomorrow. Of course, we're not sure, but it's very interesting to look at these seed forms. So just to give you an example, think about Marx when he was writing about the workers. When he was writing about the workers, there were only a few thousand workers in Manchester and Birmingham. And yet, he predicted capitalism, right? He saw that this model, with the factory and the workers, would be what would take over the whole world. So, this is what I'm doing in a way. I'm looking at the commons economy, at an emerging new form of economy, and I'm trying to find out, a bit like an anthropologist or a sociologist, what it means for society. So this is kind of the story I would like to tell you. And now I'm going to go from the future to the past, because I think it's very interesting if you want to know what's happening today, if we look at transitions in the past. All right? So let me introduce you a Japanese philosopher who wrote a book called The Structure of World History. La estructura de la historia mundial. And he distinguishes 4 basic ways of allocating resources in society. Like food and shelter and eventually money. So the things we need, education, the things we need to live. How is that distributed in society historically? Now, let's go back to the very early history of humanity, hunter-gathering societies. The main modality of distribution then was the commons. In other words, pooling resources. Imagine you're 15, 20, 30 people traveling around, you're a nomad. Property doesn't make sense because everything you own you have to carry. Right? So a hunter or the gatherers, which most often were the females, would gather, but it would be distributed for the whole family. There was no market, there was even no gift economy, and there was no state. So this is kind of the first dominant relationship that we had. Now imagine that one of these groups starts to stay in one place. Now, when you're a nomad and you have a conflict, you can move. Once you're fixed in a place, you're sedentarized, that doesn't work. So that's the birth of the gift economy, right? So I don't know if you know about the history of the North American Indians. They had this festival called the potlatch. Every year, the surpluses of one tribe would be given away in a big festival and all the other tribes were invited, right? So basically, the logic of the gift economy is I give you something, and this means you owe me something back. It's not a market. It's based on the idea of reciprocity, right? You feel, in a way, it sounds a bit strange, but when I give you something, I create inequality because now you owe me. And so the only way to restore the relationship is to give me something back in the future. All right, so that's the second dominant form of allocating resources that was in the tribal societies, in the more bigger tribal federations. Now the third one is a bit more difficult to explain because the tribal societies were very successful for tens of thousands of years to avoid classes and to avoid the state. So the theory here is that some tribe that was faced with a catastrophe like climate change was forced to invade another tribe. Now, once you do that, reciprocity doesn't work, right? If I conquer your land, it's very difficult to do a gift economy. So that one's the logic of the state, and the logic of the state is very simple: plunder and redistribute, or rule and protect. So you cannot maintain domination just by force. You have to give something back. So I'll just give you an example. The Incas, they would go to a new tribe and they would say, if you join us, your agricultural productivity will go up by 10. You will have roads, you will have silos, you will have pensions. And if you don't join us, we kill you. That was the deal. Right? So this is the third logic of allocation, which is redistributing, right? And in our society, the labor movement, the women's movement, the universal suffrage movement, were all movements that pacified, democratized the state, which act as a redistribution engine in our societies. The market, the last one. The market was always something marginal in every society until Western society and the 18th century. The market was also something on the side. For example, in a tribal context, the market was something you did with people you didn't trust. You would leave something on the beach, like the Phoenicians, and then you would see who would take it, and they would put something back. So the market was also something very marginal. Now, in the West, after the fall of the Roman Empire, we did not succeed in recreating an empire. That gave us free cities. In the free cities, we could develop the market, the merchant guilds, the craft guilds, and they eventually developed the market until it became dominant, took power, and this gave us a current type of society, right? The 18th century revolutions, more or less. Okay, so why is this important? Because it means that transition is nothing new. We have had transitions in the past, in transition of a value regime, and I want to explain what that means, a value regime. So I want you to think about the work of a nurse, right? Caring for people who are sick. Think about how this works in our society. You probably, some people may be old enough to remember that 50 years, 70 years ago, most nurses were nuns, right? So a nun was mostly voluntary. She may not even be paid, and that's very, very little, and living in a monastery. Now, think about how we see this in a capitalist society. What is the value of a voluntary nurse in a capitalist society? It's zero. It's neutral. It doesn't create GDP, right? So this is what a value regime means. It means that you take something which you think is useful, but we actually say this has no value. Now take a second example, a nurse that works in the public service. What kind of value is she creating? She is destroying value. She costs money, right? So when you have a crisis, we shut down public hospitals because we think that the value is created in the market, and therefore people who work for the state are considered to be a cost. Do you follow that reasoning, right? Now, who is creating value in our society? Only the nurses who work in the market. They are creating surplus value for the market. So this is a value regime. There's no reason that it should be that way. It's just that this is how our society has decided what is value and what is not value, right? So for example, domestic work, women who stay at home, are not recognized as creating value. So this is a value regime, and so what we have in history is changes in value regimes. I'll give you one example. This is a fantastic book that I recommend to everyone. It's called The First European Revolution. So at the end of the Roman Empire, 5th century, until the 10th century, the social structure of the Roman Empire had not changed. The politics were different masters, but the structure was the same. And it was essentially a plunder economy. You get rich by invading your neighbor. By the 10th century, this was becoming intolerable. The early knights were stealing from the church, taking the gold from the churches. They were raping their farmers, etc., etc. So in the 10th century, in France, 975, we have a social revolution. You have the monks of Cluny with the poor, with the Virgin Mary in front, that start confronting the feudal or the future feudal class with their sins. They say, why are you stealing our gold? Why are you raping our women? And in a space of 50 years, European society was completely changed. So we had, first of all, social contracts called the Peace of God contracts. These were agreements between the monks and the feudals about respecting the property of the church and the lives of their farmers. We had a shift to primogeniture, meaning the oldest son gets everything, so that you have peace in the family. The feudal class promised, make love, not war. So instead of invading your neighbor, you marry the son and the daughter together, right? So you avoid warfare. So all these changes created a feudal regime in which in the next 3 centuries, the population of Europe doubled. The population of Western Europe tripled. The cities came back, the roads came back, the ceramics came back, and people had a 5-day working week. Can you believe that? The Sunday, day of the Lord, and Blue Monday, the day of the family. If you look at the cemeteries, women were taller than today, so which is a sign of good health. Anyway, so this is just to give you an example of a value shift from one value regime, plunder economy, to the feudal regime, which is based on the land, right? It's based on the serfs working the land and getting the surplus from the land. And then slowly in the cities, something else started to happen. Okay, so enough history. Now I want to talk about today. So what I'm telling you now is a bit like a report about what new communities, new collaborative communities, new commons-based communities are doing and how they are changing our value regime. Yes? And potentially, I see this as a new model for our society. Okay, so what is happening? Well, the first thing, and this is, I think, very important, is a shift from extractive practices to generative practices. So think about industrial agriculture. Every year you farm, you impoverish the soil, right? For example, in England, we have 100 harvests left. After 100 harvests, the soil will be dead. So this is typical from an extractive economy. We make money through extracting either value from the land or for people, right? And we are destroying the planet, and we are creating very dangerous inequalities in our society. I want to give you one example. I just come from the Netherlands, where 1 million people are now autonomous workers, so-called independent workers. 1 million, so it's about like 25–30%. These people have no unemployment insurance. These people have no pension. They will get maybe 10% of what they need in terms of pension. These people have very weak health insurance, right? So these people are now 35, 40, 45. In 15 years' time, they will come, time to get a pension, and they will have nothing. So I just want to give you a sense of extremely fast pauperization that the Western countries are going through. The number of people who lost property, for example, in the US in 2008, it's 1/3 of the population nearly lost their house and their mortgages. Yeah. So this is a very bad sign about the current value regime. And a generative regime is based on the idea of adding value to a shared resource. So I want to explain to you a bit how this works. So Christian, who's just left, will come back, will talk about urban commons. Okay, I talk about something else. I talk about digital commons. Worldwide communities that create value together and are creating economies around this shared value, right? So I want to explain to you how this works. So what we are creating now is something called open contributory systems. Think about the Wikipedia, if most of you will know that. Think about Linux, free software. Think about WikiHouse, carbon positive housing. Think about Wikispeed, cars that use 5 times less gas than commercial cars. These are all examples of global communities that mutualize their knowledge. They're pooling their knowledge in order to do things together. Does that make sense? And what's important is these are open systems. So they are no longer working like a classic factory or an enterprise. In an enterprise, I need to hire you. Yeah? And then basically you do what I tell you, right? It's based on subordination. Labor is a contract of subordination. You have to work in a hierarchy and you do what you're supposed to do. These communities are based on contributions. So people write encyclopedic articles, they write software, they make designs. And so the first thing we can say about the new economy, this commons economy, is that it is based on contributive communities, communities of contributors, right? Now, how do they work together? This is really interesting. And I have another friend here, I don't know where he is, Pierre Alexandre there. He's an expert in biology. So I just want you to understand this, because this is something that's really quite amazing. The average team member, the average number of people in a team in the Wikipedia is 1. The average number of people working on Linux is 4. Last week, you may have heard it, we sent the first satellite in space, which was fully open source software and hardware. So how is it possible that 30,000 people can work together without a hierarchy? This is a big mystery for most people in an enterprise, right? So how is this done? Well, this is done through something we call stigmergy. What is stigmergy? The language of the ants and the bees. Signaling, mutual signaling. Because we are building open systems, we can see everything that is happening. Think about a football team. 11 people on both sides, twice. If you're a player in a football team, you can see the whole game, right? You can see your team and you can see the other game. So nobody has to tell you what to do. The captain will tell you maybe in the beginning, what the preferred strategy is. But once you start playing, as an individual, you're completely in charge of how you will behave on the field. Does that make sense? So this is what we can now do with 30,000, 50,000, 100,000 people. We can have the same dynamic and make very complex things. Okay, so that's the first thing, contributive communities. The second thing is, how do we make a living from that? And here we have a paradox. Okay, so in capitalism, everything is based on commodities, right? So if I drink this water, it's gone, and you can't have it. So this is called a rival good. Because it's rival, it has a price. But if you mutualize and you pool knowledge, you create an abundant resource, and it has no price. So you cannot make money in that way. You cannot sell something that's abundant. But what's very important is that around this abundant resource, so around the commons, you can create a wide variety of economic activities. For example, my labor. I can get a job from a company that says, please make this free software, right? I get paid because my job, my time is still scarce. You can do certification, integration, maintenance. So this is what I'm trying to explain. Around the commons, there's an economy always. And people try to make a living around these commons. Now, maybe you think this is a small economy. I just want to give you one example. In the US, the economy around shared resources is 1/6 of GDP, 17 million people. This is not marginal. This is actually the fastest growing economic sector in the world. Because around the commons, people create jobs and people create economies. I want to give you an example. In Europe, the states make geographical information systems, maps. We believe that the state should recuperate that money. So what they do is they sell licenses every year to 2 or 3 big companies. You probably use them in your car, the GPS system, right? So this is a privatized economy. It's actually very small. In the US, the most capitalist country in the world, they actually freed the geographic information. So all the geographic information in the US is a commons. It's a common shared resource. 400,000 people work on geolocal applications. So I just want to show you that it's not because it's a commons that it doesn't create an economy. On the contrary, in this case, the commons economy actually creates a lot more jobs than the private economy, okay? So here is the thing. Around the commons, around the contributive community, we have entrepreneurial coalitions. People who create added value around the shared resources. And these can be 2 forms. One is extractive, profit maximizing companies which try to take as much value as they can from the common resource. Or it can be generative. Let me first talk about the extractive. And this is why things like Uber and Airbnb are so dangerous. So think about this. Old-style capitalism is a company, hire workers, you make a product, and you sell it at a higher price. And that's how you make a profit. The new companies, Google, Facebook, YouTube, what do they make? They make nothing. They allow us to exchange, right? Airbnb allows us to lend our apartments to each other. Google allows us to see our documents. YouTube allows us to see our videos. So we now have a new system which is very parasitical. It actually functions on the basis of our value creation, and it creates a rent that it takes out. Now, if you look at that economy, like Uber, the average wage of an Uber driver is $13 in the US. It's below the new minimum wage of $15. No health insurance, no pensions, yeah? So this is just to argue that the current form of the economy is not a good model for the shared economy. Because think about Facebook, another example. 2 billion people are exchanging communication with each other through Facebook. And you can say, wow, they pay for it, it's free, great. But none of the money that they make goes back to anyone, right? They just have a few thousand people working for them. So these are very dangerous models because they take peer-to-peer commons creation or peer-to-peer exchange and they suck value out of the system and they do not reinvest. So this is, I think, a model that is not optimal. Second model is generative. I want to give you an example. We have a lady here, Jessie, are you here? Jessie, there, from Inspiral. Okay, Inspiral is a model of what I'm talking about. So Inspiral is, they have commons called Lumio, an open source decision-making system, and Co-Budget, which is a self-reinvestment system. It allows you to reinvest the resources of a network into projects of the network. Around this, they have all kinds of companies. They have something called Inspire Academy. They have 18 social business ventures that do all kinds of activities. So that's their entrepreneurial coalition. And they are generative, right? They're thinking always, how can we add value to this shared resource? How can we make our community live better, etc., etc. The third aspect is they have an Inspire Foundation. And this is the third institution that emerges with the commons economy. I call them for benefit associations. Okay, what is a for benefit associations? They're not like NGOs as we know them. I want to give you an example. Doctors Without Borders. Now, Doctors Without Borders sees the world as there are problems, healthcare in war zones. We are going to collect resources and we are going to direct the resources to solve that problem. Now, it may sound very logical, and it is in many ways, but you have to understand this is based on an idea of scarcity. Right? A problem, scarce resources, we're going to manage that flow. Now think about the Wikimedia Foundation or Linux Foundation and all these other foundations. It's an entirely different vision. Here's the vision. We have a problem or a project, creating a universal encyclopedia, creating a free and open operating system for the computer, creating a car that doesn't pollute, creating a house that actually absorbs carbon from the air. These are all real projects, okay? The Inspire Foundation and these other foundations, what they do is the following. They think there is a problem. There's enough people in the world who may want to contribute to solving that problem. So we're going to maintain an infrastructure of cooperation. It's an entirely different vision than Doctors Without Borders, right? They're not telling anyone what to do. Wikimedia Foundation doesn't tell anyone what to do, but it allows people to continue to work on the Wikipedia, on Linux, etc., etc. Okay, so this is the microeconomy of the commons economy, right? This is when you look at it from the point of view of the actors. Now, what I would like to do is now make a jump and make my case to say that this is also a new model of society and the economy as a whole. Now, I go back to Kojin Karatani, who has a very interesting view of our current system. He says, we often think capitalism is just the market and, businesses. He says, no, it's actually three modes of allocation, three modes of exchange into one. He calls it capital, state, nation. Right? So capital dominates, and then we have the state, and we have the citizens in a country, the nation. And so he says, why is the system so strong? Because when one of the three is in danger, the two others come to its rescue. So it's very hard to change. It's not just capital, it's not just the state, it's the three in one. So if you want to change it, you cannot just say, like the socialists did, let's change the private market by the state. You actually have to change everything at the same time. So I call this a multimodal approach. You have to work on the modalities at the same time. Now, if you think about how did we get our current capitalist democratic societies? And to say that in short, we have capitalism because we had capitalists, right? For centuries, the merchants in the free cities first and then in the nations created systems that made the market work better and better, gave them more and more power until they became dominant. And they adopted the state and the nation and different other systems to their needs. So here's the problem today. And this is another very important author which I recommend. It's called The Great Transformation from Karl Polanyi. It's a history of the current system from the late 18th century until 1944. He talks about something, the double movement. Okay, here's the thing. You have periods in history in which the market tries to escape from society. Right? The idea of a self-regulating market. Free markets means that the market doesn't listen to anything else than its own signals. Right? This is the current dominant system, neoliberalism, is based on the idea of free market. In other periods of history, let's say the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, you have the opposite movement. You have the nation, people in the nation, revolting against the power of the market and re-embedding, redisciplining the market according to social and societal logics, right? So this is the double movement. It goes from one to the other. In English, we say lib-lab, liberal labor, liberal labor. Every 30 years, more or less, it changes. And this no longer works. Why doesn't it work? Very easy. Because state and nation operates at the nation level, but capital now works at a global level, right? So this is why we don't believe in politics anymore. Because even if we elect another party, what can they do, really? Look at Syriza in Greece, right? In 6 months, went from a very radical program to basically submitting to the Troika. And Greece actually lost its sovereignty. Everything they vote in the parliament in Greece comes from Europe, right? It's not discussed in Greece anymore. So this system we can't change it at the level of the nation state. This is just a reality. Now, how we can change is another and maybe more difficult issue, but I want to give you some ideas. So let's look again at the system I just described. The commons and its contributive community. A generative, ethical economic coalition which tries to create added value on top of the commons. And these for-benefit associations which manage the whole infrastructure. So here's what I'm proposing. Think of this at a whole level. It's the level of society. So potentially we are moving to a new form of society in which civil society becomes the core. Not the market, not the private sector, but citizens and inhabitants, right? And we have to consider today citizens being productive, right? So the idea is that we decide what value is, not the market players. Okay, so this is called value sovereignty. Yes, I don't know if you're familiar with the idea of food sovereignty. I think in Tenerife, most of your food comes outside, right? So if the global system collapses, you have nothing. 50 years ago, you probably made the food locally. So the idea of food sovereignty is to be master of your food, right? That Tenerife would become more resilient and self-sufficient in its food production, so that if anything happens in a declining world system, you can still feel safe about your food provision, okay? Now think about the same idea around value sovereignty. Our productive communities, our commons-based productive communities decide what value is. Now we just conducted a study, it's called P2P value. It studied 300 peer production communities, commons-based collaborative communities. And this is I was surprised myself. 85% of these 300 communities practice something called open value accounting, contributory accounting. 85%. So what it means is they work with the market. Yes, the market is everything outside. But inside, they decide to distribute the value differently according to their own social logics. They decide what value is. Yes? And so around it, you need some kind of membrane, you know, like a cell, right? Every living thing has a membrane. We have a skin. The skin is what regulates the relationship between the new communities, the new value communities, and the existing market. Now, when I talk to people on the left, I always get the same reaction. Capitalism will co-opt it. And that's the end of the discussion. Nothing new. We can continue to complain. What I propose is the opposite. It's reverse co-optation. Yeah, what is reverse co-optation? It's that your value community decides to do the opposite. Today, most of the resources are in the market and in the state. So you decide to find mechanisms that can attract value from the outside, but you discipline it to the needs of your productive community. Again, Spiral may talk about this. One of the things that Spiral does is called capped investment. Now, I'm not sure about the details of how they do it in Spiral. I'll just say it in general. So what is capped investment? As you know today, 90% of the money is not in the productive system, right? It's in the speculative system. It doesn't make things. And it's not working very well for them anymore. And we now have negative interest rates. So if you put the money on a bank, you lose, right? You lose money. So what if we can say to them, well, you invest in this project, and we give you 5% for 10 years or 15 years, right? But you build a wall between the investment and your productive community. So not like venture capital, you don't let capital decide what you do, but you promise them a return. At the end of 10 years, you say, this resource, thank you, it's now for the community, it's now a shared resource, right? So this is called, difficult word, sorry, transvestment, right? Creating a stream of value from another system to the new system. Okay, so just to give you ideas of what these people are doing. So I'm going back to my macro. Civil society has become productive and is now the core of our new society. The market has become a generative market. This means that the market players stop thinking extractively, but generatively. For example, if you're a farmer, if you switch to eco-agriculture or to permaculture, every year you farm, the soil is better than the year before, right? This is a completely different vision of farming. And you may not know this, but you probably read the newspaper just as I do. For example, in France, industrial agriculture is collapsing. There are hundreds of suicides every week, and there are hundreds of farms closing every week because they can no longer produce milk and pork according to the market system. It's just not working. They get less money than it costs them to produce. The only ones that are doing well are eco-farmers. They're the only ones who actually are improving their condition. So the generative, in a system where we are destroying the planet, the people who do generative activities actually do better because they have a long-term vision, they improve their resource base, etc., instead of impoverishing their resource base. So this is the second thing. It's thinking about an ethical market which can operate at societal level. And the third thing, and I don't know how much time I have left. So this is the idea of a partner state. So think about these 4 benefit associations. They don't tell people what to do, but they facilitate, enable, and empower, right? So this is something that also Christian will talk about. So I'll just mention it briefly. In Bologna, the Bologna regulation for the care and regeneration of the urban commons reverses the logic of the state. Normally the state produces services, public services, social services, and we citizens, we passively consume these resources. We can vote for them every 4 years, but that's it, right? We don't have any say. Now in Bologna, the local communities can say, we want this to be a common resource. An abandoned building, an abandoned factory, improving the street, improving a park. And then they make a proposal to the city. There's an evaluation process, and then the city helps the citizens to carry out their activity. In other words, this is a state form that enables citizens to become autonomous, individually and socially, right? It's an entirely different vision. And I think it's realistic because this is not based on like the way I would like things to be. It's actually based on what these communities are already doing at a micro level, right? So think about the end of the Roman Empire and the end of every empire. This is very interesting. This This is how humanity has survived in the past. This has happened a dozen times. So here's a general rule. Every competitive system destroys its resource base, right? If I'm a country or a feudal lord and I'm competing with another feudal lord to be the strongest, and this shows throughout history, they will tend to overuse their resources. And then eventually, society collapses. So what do we do when society collapses? We do three things. I'll give the example of Europe after the Roman Empire. First, we mutualize resources, knowledge, sorry. So think about a monastery. What is a monastery? The cities were collapsing, the academies, the Greek and Roman academies were collapsing. Rome went from 1 million people to 80 million people. So the knowledge system was completely broken. But the monks, who were the educated class of their time, created monasteries, traveled around, and were responsible for 90% of technological innovation in that period, 10th to the 13th century. 90%. They were engineers, farmers, agricultural, etc. The second thing we do, and every civilization has done it when it was faced with a catastrophe, is mutualize infrastructure. So what is a monastery? Again, everybody has lodging, everybody has food, but at only 5% of the cost of the Roman ruling class. Right? So this is the second thing. It happened in China, Japan, Europe, everywhere. Third thing, relocalize production. So what are we doing now? We are mutualizing knowledge. The open source movement, the free software movement, the open design movement are movements today. They're not monks, because society has changed, but that's what they're doing. They're remutualizing knowledge. The second thing is the sharing economy. And of course, there's a bad example, which is Uber and Airbnb and the way they do it, which is not a good model. But that's what they're doing. They are mutualizing physical resources, right? Think about Airbnb. It doesn't build new hotels. It reuses what we already have, right? Now, I want to give you an example of why their model doesn't work. This is an example from Uber. Normally, if you share cars, one shared car can replace 12 to 24 private cars. Amazing, right? But what happens with Uber? In theory, that's what they should do. But what Uber does, it destroys the commons. It lets everybody compete against each other. A driver doesn't know what another driver is doing. A driver cannot connect independently with a client, right? If you use these systems, you know this. You cannot do it. You cannot work together. You can only pass through them and then pay your tax. So the result is that, and I've seen this with my own eyes, I was in Madison, Wisconsin. On Saturday, Friday, you have hundreds of Uber drivers driving around, competing to get the clients. So this is the bad way to do it. But the idea, the general idea is very important. We have to share material infrastructures. Yeah? So that's what we are doing with the sharing economy, but mostly in a bad way. And the third thing, which was mentioned in the introduction, is relocalizing production. Okay. I use the concept of cosmo-local production. So it's not only local and it's not just globalization. It's something new. Here's the rule, very simple, very easy to understand and to think about. Everything that's light is global, everything that's heavy is local. Right? So everything that's light is global means we mutualize our knowledge in open source communities. Engineers, farmers, we work together to mutualize our knowledge so that everywhere in the world we can learn from each other how to do more sustainable circular economies. But everything that's heavy, we can do more locally. An example is the tennis balls from Wimbledon. Do you know how many miles they represent? 40,000. The ingredients for every tennis ball used in Wimbledon together have traveled 40,000 miles. We spend 3 times more on transport than on actually making things today. And the GDP of transportation is bigger than the GDP of manufacturing. we cannot continue like this, right? So cosmo-local production, design global, produce local, is the idea of rebuilding our economies, for example, in Tenerife, right? This was what Barcelona tried to do, and I'm not sure the new government is doing it, but the old mayor, it was called Fab City 5.0. 50% of production in Barcelona should be local by 2050. 50% of food and 50% of industry. In order to prepare for this, they were investing in 24 fab labs, one in every neighborhood of Barcelona. And the idea was that to make them also subject specific. So textiles, the book industry, I don't know in Tenerife, but for example in Barcelona, the craftsmen are dying, right? They're old, and their knowledge is getting lost. But we have young people who know how to use computers and do design on computers. So you use these fab labs to put them together, the people with the old expertise and the young people who have a new expertise. And the idea is to revitalize through micro factories local production. Today, seriously, and especially as the system is going to dislocate further, we can make cars. Wikispeed, the Tabby, there's 30 open source cars. They're all sustainable. All of them. This is very important, and maybe I'll close with this. And this is really very important. If we design in a company, in an enterprise, even if I'm a very progressive, ecologically conscious entrepreneur, how I am going to design? I'm designing for scarcity, right? Because I need a market. So if I make a car, I'm going to do something which is called planned obsolescence. You have your computers, even your green computers, they break down in 2.5 years. Everything on them is designed together to break down at the same time. So if it isn't your screen, it will be your hard drive. It's not your hard drive. Same with the iPad. If you have an iPad, after 400 times of charging, it's dead. You cannot change it. You have to solder to change it. So you go to the Apple store, and they tell you, well, okay, for $275, I can repair it, or for $350, you can buy a new one, right? So this is systemic. This is not a bug. This is systemic. This is how you design as a company. We have lamps in Los Alamos laboratory in California that has been burning since 1908. Where can you find it in the market? You can't. Because if you would make them in our type of society, you go broke. Everybody would have these lights after a few years and you can't sell anymore. So it's very important that we shift design into these productive communities, that we make open design, which by its nature is sustainable design. And then we make them in microfactories, interconnected microfactories, using open circular economy. Okay, I have to finish. Open supply chains, open accounting. This is the basis of a mutual coordination economy, where if you are in a coalition around the commons, you are codependent of a shared resource. As an entrepreneur, you can start working together by opening your supply chain. So you move from linear, private supply chains to open, shared supply chains, where you can see from each other what your surplus is and what kind of, you can create circular economy. To be honest, without it, we will never succeed the shift to a circular economy. If every company keeps its information secret, we are never going to make the shift to a circular economy. So I just want to make the conclusion that this openness is absolutely essential for everything, right? So here it is. LSD, in French, libre, soutenable, et solidaire, right? So free, in the sense of shared knowledge, sustainable, in harmony with the environment, and solidary, a fair distribution of the resources in the people who actually create the value. So this is the proposal for Tenerife. And thank you for listening, and I hope you could follow me. There's a lot of new concepts and words and all, and they don't seem to be sweating too much in the translator booth. They're still smiling, so it wasn't too bad. So thanks to everyone, and yeah, that's it. Thank you.